Configure vNetwork's standard switches and VSS policies. Okay, so at this point we've worked with ESXi, we've got it up and running, and we've got vCenter up and running, and we've kind of connected the two. Between that last nugget and this one, I actually got the other ESX server plugged into vCenter, so I effectively have two ESX servers, both of which are being controlled by a vCenter server. Now, we're not yet to the point where we can actually start working with virtual machines. We've got to work on some of these core infrastructure pieces like networking and storage that are important before we can actually get to that point. We're going to start first with networking. And we start first with networking because most of the types of networking, or most of the types of storage that you'll be using in your ESX environment will be the types of storage that is remote, that is connected to via some kind of network. A little later on we'll talk about how you can use iSCSI networks. Now you can configure iSCSI networks to connect to iSCSI storage. But even before that, we have to talk about the whole process of how ESX and vCenter handle networking in the virtual environment. Now, as you can see here, we call them vNetworks, or virtual networks. And there are two types of switches that are predominantly important with vSphere today. Those are standard switches and distributed switches. The primary difference between the two is that a standard switch, when you configure a standard switch, its configuration is for the specific ESX host that you're working on. And this is a great and small environment. They're very easy to work with. A couple of important things you need to know, but essentially you have to make sure with standard switches that the configuration on one host is equivalent to the configuration on all the other hosts. Again, great in the small environment. They get a little more challenging in the larger environments because as you got 300 hosts instead of 3 hosts, well, making sure that all those switches are correctly configured gets a little bit more challenging. So in this nugget, we're going to talk about standard switches and the networking policies that you can associate with those standard switches. We're going to talk about their capabilities, and then also here in just a minute we're going to talk about the different ways in which you can configure those switches, not only in a VLAN configuration, but also in a direct connection configuration. I've got a kind of an image I'll show you here in just a second that will help you understand how that works. Then when we get into the click-by-click part, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can interact with those standard switches and create and administer VM NICs and ports and port groups, VM kernel ports and network services, and all the other fun things that are required in order to get a switch into a usable configuration for how your virtual machines are going to need them. Before we get to, however, the whole interaction piece, what I want to do is help you in a visual format understand all the different kinds of networks that a VMware environment needs to be aware of and that you probably need to plan for as you're thinking about designing your environment. There are actually quite a few different kinds of networks that are important to be aware of. Let's assume that this is just an ESX server here. I've got just a basic ESX server here in the middle, and coming out of that server I want to plug in all of the different networks that I need to be aware of so that I can support all the different needs my environment needs. Now obviously, as you can imagine, a VMware environment is going to need to have some sense of production networking, right? These are when my virtual machines are running. They are, maybe it's an Exchange server. The Exchange server needs to talk to its Outlook clients over some sort of network, and that production network is generally the network where that communication occurs. Now in most situations that production network is going to be a dual connection minimum, and there are dual bonded connections so that if I lose one of those physical connections, well then I have the ability to continue to pass that network over the remaining connection, or the surviving connection. Now production network is important because obviously that's that communication path between my virtual machine workloads and the clients or